Hello everyone. I have not worn my glasses, so I actually can't really see any of you, which is totally fine. So I'll be speaking about the impact of Jew hatred on Jews, addressing internalized anti-Jewishness. And this is really the structure of my new book, which is coming out in October. It is a sequel to the first book that I wrote, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. So, and as has been the case really throughout this entire conference thus far, conversations on Jew hate rarely center Jewish people. It's about what is said about Jews, what is done to Jews. It's not about Jews themselves. It's not about our lived experience, our reality. So first of all, I want to recognize that Jew hatred is a non-Jewish problem that impacts Jews. So that then will impact how we talk about it, who we think is responsible for solving it. And while I say that it is really the responsibility of the non-Jewish world to solve this problem, if indeed that is possible, we have work to do as Jews. We take part in the fight, obviously, but we have internal work to do as well. And unfortunately, an often ignored but incredibly significant manifestation of Jew hatred is internalized Jew hate. Now, there was a comment from my now very good friend Chloe last week at Cambridge about there are conversations about internalized Jew hatred taking place, but they're really in the academic world, and they haven't yet filtered down into kind of the mainstream Jewish world, let's say, which means people are suffering, because I believe this is a pandemic. People are suffering and they are not being equipped to solve this problem, to heal, and I will explain further. So I've defined internalized Jew hatred as when Jews absorb non-Jewish perceptions of Jews, Jewishness and Judaism and allow the non-Jewish world to define our narratives. So I'm very much stepping away from this idea of self-hate. You notice I haven't even said that once in however long I've been speaking for. This is not just about self-hate. That is a symptom perhaps, but like everything we want to get to the cause. Why is this happening? And I believe this is why it is happening. So sometimes in the Jewish world, people say that this does not exist. They say Jews do not have this experience. My perspective is of a gay man. So I can share with you, I won't do it because I don't have very much time to speak, but I could share with you my own experiences of internalized homophobia, which deeply impacted my kind of very important teenage years. And there is a huge amount, and this really speaks to actually the things that we were saying yesterday about how other communities are further on in these conversations perhaps than we are. So there is a huge amount of very important literature about internalized anti-black racism from within the black community. So Kamara Phyllis-Jones, a black anti-racism activist, detailed in her paper, Levels of Racism, a Theoretic Framework and a Gardener's Tale, that internalized anti-black racism is rooted in acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. It is characterized by their not believing in others who look like them and not believing in themselves. It involves accepting limitations to one's own full humanity, including one's spectrum of dreams and one's right to self-determination. Now, Jones has defined internalized anti-black racism as one of the three major manifestations of anti-black racism. So it's really up there, the other being institutional and personally mediated. So if Jones is saying this about this phenomenon in the black community, we can perhaps understand that internalized anti-Jewishness is one of the main manifestations of anti-Jewish hatred, but yet we never really talk about it, especially in the mainstream world. So I will now go through very briefly, of course, some reasons why it occurs, some of the main manifestations, and my work, because I'm not actually an academic, my work is not just about analysing and understanding, it's about trying to propose a solution. So that is what Pride is attempting to offer, a solution to Jewish people who may feel that their Jewish self-esteem is not as developed as they might like it to be. So in 1947, Trudvise Rosemoren said, "To be a Jew in a non-Jewish world has always been and will continue to be a handicap in more ways than one." And I very much think this is still the case. But why? Why does this happen? So this was referenced earlier today, actually, about our identities being defined by the other. And this can happen in an interpersonal way. You know, if I can say to my partner, oh, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, and he could be like, no, you're fine, don't worry about it. So I'm seeing myself through his eyes, and that can be, for the most part, positive. When we come to societal, that is where the complication comes. Because number one, particularly with regards to, and Devin spoke about this, minority and majority, the majority has no right to define the experience or identity of the minority. It often happens, but they have no right to do that. And then number two, with regards to the Jewish experience, we are attempting to integrate, and I will speak about integration in just a moment, into societies really which are founded on Jew hatred. Particularly if we look at the West, it was founded, I believe, using Jew hatred, forming non-Jewish identities based on Jews. So that creates a very difficult dynamic. So our identity is created or fed back to us through the majority, which is very damaging because they simply do not understand what it means to be Jewish or whatever the identity you might be talking about. And what this does is create categories of good Jews and bad Jews. So good Jews and bad Jews don't exist. I said on Twitter, love a tweet, I said there's no good Jews or bad Jews, there's only Jews. There's only proud Jews, actually. And good Jews and bad Jews is, again, remember, per their understanding of our identity. It's not about, if you like the Shabbat candles or if you keep kosher, that's irrelevant. It's about, do we conform to their expectations of our identity? Are we palatable? And some examples of this were in the 19th century with the scientific study of Judaism, which was called Wissenschaft des Judentum. And that is not inherently a bad thing. The scientific modern study of Judaism is not inherently bad, of course. But what we saw was kind of enlightened, emancipated German Jews use Eastern European Jews, use the Ostjuden to define their identities as good Jews, which was the creation of this character called the Schlemiel, and that was all rooted in non-Jewish expectations of Jewish identity in Germany in the 19th century. They wanted to show we're good German Jews. So they had to reject, they had to be, they're good Jews, so they had to have the bad Jew. I have done this myself. I used to say, I'm Jewish but. What was I saying? I'm Jewish but, and what I was meaning was I'm not Orthodox. I'm not one of those Jews. I'm a Jew that you can understand. Or I'm Zionist but. Those are things that we regularly say and we may not even think about them. And this really goes on to another reason, and there's many more reasons why this occurs, but for the sake of not being so long-winded, I will only have a couple. The next is the difficulty of Jewish integration. I believe that it is inherently difficult for Jews to integrate. It is not impossible, but I believe that it is difficult. Why is it difficult? Because we're trying to integrate, particularly in a Western context, into societies that, again, were founded in opposition to us. And it may not be in opposition to me as Ben, but in opposition to us as a collective. And again, what happened in the 19th century was we were forced, coerced, into giving up our specificity. Our specificity, which had maintained our identities for 2,000 years in exile. That specificity is particularly important to Jews. Because without it, we simply would not exist, and we would have ceased to existed many, many hundreds of years ago. But in this period, the non-Jewish world coerced us, I believe. They made promises to us. They made us accept contracts that we had not asked for. And there was many terms and conditions about universality, about how we fit into their idea, again, of good Jews. And ultimately, we're forced to choose. And we used to have this conversation ourselves. If there was a war between Britain and Israel, who would you fight for? That's what the conversation was when I was a kid. And I think that iterations of that conversation happen all over the world. We're forced to choose. Well, are you a British Jew or are you a Jewish Brit? And again, it is possible to integrate. But to do so, you have to understand the rules of engagement, and we'll get to that. So that was very, very brief about why this occurs, and let's look at the major manifestations. So George Eliot, which was the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, wrote in 1876, "I wish I had not been born a Jew. I will disown any bond with the long travail of my race. I will outdo the Gentile in mocking at our separateness." So I've identified three different major manifestations of internalized anti-Jewishness. The first being diminishment. And these are just three words that begin with D. They're not the three Ds, because I know that is taken by Mr. Sharansky, and I would not dare be so bold as to Take that. So just 3 words that begin with D. Diminishment. That is what I was talking about. I'm Jewish, but. I'm Zionist, but. I was making my Jewishness smaller. I was qualifying it by saying I'm a good Jew. I'm a Jew that you can understand. Yes, I have these traditions and customs, but I'm still like you. We can still relate to each other. We alter ourselves. We alter our names. We altered the concept of what it meant to be a Jew, moving in the end of the 18th century from a more people, national understanding to a very specific religious understanding. The Reform movement in the United States, which I am a Reform Jew, but the Reform movement in 1875 had the Pittsburgh platforms which said, we are no longer a nation, we're just a religious community, shedding 4,000 years of Jewish identity. And again, this is all rooted in being good Jews, fitting in with the world that we're living in, and ultimately choosing. Denial. That is the second manifestation. And that is pretty self-explanatory. It's when one denies one's Jewishness. Historically, this would have meant converting to another religion. We have many examples of this from throughout history. Johannes Pfefferkorn was one of the examples. He was a Jew who converted to Christianity. And then, because of the complication of Jewish identity, because of actually the fact that Jewishness is in some ways an immutable characteristic, he had to then deploy his former Jewishness as a weapon against the Jewish community in order to prove that he was a good Christian. So that is perhaps a little complicated, but it is what it is. Then we have Ella Emhoff. Now again, I'm not saying that Ella Emhoff, who is the stepdaughter of the Vice President of the United States, Mrs. Harris. So Vice President of the United States, her stepdaughter is Ella Emhoff. She is a model and an artist, and she went to the inauguration, obviously, and she wore her, what is described as curly hair. She wore her hair natural. And tweets were sent by Jewish women all over the world celebrating this. They thought, wow, this Jewish woman did not feel the need to alter her identity in this kind of the world's biggest platform. Forward magazine that we've heard about just a moment ago in the last session, they wanted to include Ella in the top 50 American Jews. A note was sent to Ella and her publicist sent a very polite message back. It was very polite and it said, Ella is not Jewish. Now Ella's father is Jewish, her mother is not, so as per halakhic understandings, no, Ella is not Jewish, but I do not just include those whose mothers are Jewish in the Jewish people. I also believe that someone whose father is Jewish is just as Jewish. And what Ella's identity tells us is again the defining of one's identity per the non-Jewish world. Because the statement followed, Ella does not celebrate Jewishness, so therefore it is not something that applies to her. It's not a faith that she believes in. So as per Ella's understanding, Judaism is just a faith, it's just a religion, therefore she has no connection to it. And I'm not saying that Ella should or shouldn't feel Jewish. I'm really not. I'm just using it as an example of when Jews allow the non-Jewish world to define our identities. Because, again, we have to understand and remember that the idea that Jews are just a religion is a non-Jewish idea. It was to fit in with post-enlightened ideas of citizens of modern nation states. And then the last is deployment. So this is the most extreme example, and it's the one that many of us are familiar with, but importantly, it's not the only example. The Yevsiksia were a group of Jews in the early Soviet Union who were trying to bring Soviet Jews into the revolution. And they destroyed Jewish life. We have anti-Zionist Jews today. I believe anti-Zionist Jews today have absorbed non-Jewish definitions of or non-Jewish perceptions on the State of Israel, non-Jewish definitions of Zionism, for example, and have reacted against it. I see you there. And Zemmour, Eric Zemmour. And I say this in my book, and I'll say this now, my work largely focuses on the left. I'm a gay British Jew. That is my context. But this is not just an issue on the left. It also exists on the right, and Eric Zemmour was a very kind of recent and well-known example of a Jew who is reacting against his Jewishness, who had made a choice. And he had chosen France. And he said, and he tweeted, my grandfather was Napoleon and my grandmother was Joan of Arc. And that's really, he was defining his identity as primarily being a French person. His Jewishness came later. And it's why he said that the French Jews who were murdered in Toulouse when they were buried in Israel, he described them as traitors. Because for someone who prioritizes Frenchness, They are traitors. Why are you running off to Israel? You might be a Jew, but you're French first, according to Zemmour and that line of thinking. So from pre-modern to modern, there isn't a single Jew who doesn't carry within himself at least the beginning of Jewish self-hatred. And this is a quote by Theodore Lessing. I don't know if I necessarily agree with this, but I would say that there isn't a single Jew who doesn't carry within themselves the capacity for internalized anti-Jewishness. So the first example we have is epispasm and the Jews. So we talk a lot about Hellenized Judaism, which was an evolution of Judaism when the Greeks ruled Judea. One of the manifestations of this was Jewish men and boys attempting to reverse their circumcisions. Why? Because in Greek society was centered on the gymnasium, which literally translates as school for naked exercise. Naked exercise, so you went into the gymnasium naked. It wasn't just exercise, it was a place for learning, a place for meeting, a place for socializing. So if a Jew or anyone wants to get ahead in society, that was the place they had to be. Jews were circumcised, so they could not enter. And the Greeks also believed that to be circumcised was to be mutilated. So they attempted to reverse their circumcisions. This was about 2,300 years ago. And these were Jews living in the Jewish indigenous land. They may not have been ruling it, it was colonized, but they were still in the homeland. We're going to fast forward, about 2,000 years and look at Moses Mendelssohn and the Haskalah. And it's been said that modernity has been the greatest thing and it was this amazing change in the Jewish circumstance. And it was an amazing change in the Jewish circumstance. But it also has had very serious repercussions with regards to Jewish identity. And what it created, in my opinion, was an identity crisis. Jews having to choose once again. And Moses Mendelssohn, when he translated the Torah into German, using Hebrew letters, but he translated it into German, he said it was the first step towards culture. And Moses Mendelssohn was trying to save the Jewish people. He wanted them to say Jewish. But he was basing his understanding of what it meant to be a good Jew on the non-Jewish world, how they perceive us, the prioritizing of German culture. And he also participated in the denigration of Ostjuden, Eastern European Jews, and described Yiddish as a language of stammers, corrupt and deformed, repulsive to those who are able to speak in a correct and elegant manner. Which is a very demonizing thing to say about a beautiful part of Jewish civilization. And a rich part of Jewish civilization. So modern. Now there's many different examples of this. One that I will touch on briefly, and I'm not going to say very much about it actually because we've heard so much about it, is about the left and the Jews. And I say this as someone who considers himself on the left. But what has happened, particularly since the millennium, is that the more historic, or let's say, the more hard left ideas about Israel have entered into the mainstream because of the internet. And that is something I don't think we've discussed enough, to be quite honest. The internet is a major factor in all of this. It is one of the major front lines. And it's why Jews who identify as on the left are experiencing an identity crisis. Because anti-Zionism has become broadly speaking, a leftist position. Now, of course, not everyone on the left is anti-Jewish and not every part of the left is anti-Jewish. Of course not. But we're speaking broadly here. And this has created ideas that it is not possible to be a proud Zionist Jew, or let's just say a Zionist Jew, and still be left. So you have to choose once again. And Alyssa Rubin, who is an If Not Now volunteer, and If Not Now is an organization that is in the United States that says it's a Jewish organization, although that is, there's questions about that, and it really campaigns for the Palestinians, but in a way which is very problematic to many people. Anyway, Alyssa Rubin said that the Black Lives Matter protests created a whole new wave of people who are really primed to see the connection and understand racism more explicitly. She said, understanding the ways racism plays out here, i.e. the United States of America, and then looking at Israel/Palestine and realizing it is the exact same system. So this is part of the, Israel's an apartheid state, Israel's committing genocide, part of this family of thought. And it is not true, but these are prevalent ideas on the left. And this has again created an identity crisis, Jews having to choose. So what is a solution? I think that us sitting here and just going over How much everyone hates us and how deeply rooted it is in society is important, but for the average person in the street, we have to be offering something practical. How are they going to navigate the world they're living in? My kind of offering is rooted in pride. And this is rooted in, as I said, my experience as a gay person, the journey that I had to take from immense amounts of internalized homophobia, suicidal ideation, self-harm, to being proud of my sexual orientation. So that was my framework. So that's the world I come from. So true advice, Rosamund, we're going to refer to her again, said the positive side and worthwhileness of being a Jew will have to be stressed and bolstered by props beyond the sullying reach of the Jew hater. So let's look at what this might look like. So in the first book that I wrote, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, I talk about Jewish Pride as a goal and as a movement that we're building. But since I've realized that actually it's not just a goal or a movement, it's a framework. It's a pair of spectacles that you can put on that can help you understand Jewish experience and Jewish history through the Jewish lens. You know, as Charles keeps saying, we have to understand the Jewish perspective on all of this. What is the Jewish perspective on our own history? What are examples of Jewish resistance that, you know, are countless throughout our history? What are examples of successful integration? You know, we have to look at our history, look at our experience with, I believe, a pride framework, and not just talking about our history or our experience through a veil of tears. Yes, there is sadness in our experience. Yes, there is tragedy in our experience, but our experience is not sad. To be a Jew is not tragic. It is incredible. The fact that we're sitting in this room discussing Jewish identity in 2022 is a miracle, and I don't mean that from a biblical sense. It is incredible, and we should celebrate it. And that pride is an antidote to seeing what is said about us, to understanding what is done to us, to not feeling safe in specific spaces anymore. I do not feel safe in LGBTQ plus spaces any longer. And that is a community that I worked bloody hard to be a part of. And now I've just been expelled. Because I will not say that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Israel does have a right to exist, and I will not compromise. Thanks. I'm not finished yet though. I'm still going. And now I've lost my train of thought. Israel has a right to exist, etc. So yes, that is a Jewish pride framework. And I think it is central to this work. Because when we get up in front of our students, what are they going to walk away with? Oh God, to be Jewish is horrible. It's terrible. No, it's not. So when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we're talking about Anne Frank or whatever experience we're talking about the Shoah, we also have to make sure our students understand the beauty, the joy, why we're still Jewish, why we haven't just packed it in, because it would be easier. But there's a reason we haven't. Secondly, and this kind of connects to what I was saying, Jewish mirrors. We have to understand our experience and identity through Jewish perspectives, because there are many, of course. There are basic historical truths about where we came from. We can trace our ancestry, and I'm not meaning genetically. We can trace, you know, where we came from, where our culture comes from. So there are truths that we should celebrate and recognize, but of course there's different perspectives that all should be included in our Jewish mirrors. But we have to see ourselves through our own eyes. We cannot be looking at the non-Jewish world to find out who we are, because for 2,000 years they haven't got it right. And my opinion is the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So, and then Jewish integration. I'm British. So I said previously that it's inherently hard for Jews to integrate. I think that is true. It doesn't mean it's impossible. I'm a proud British Jew. I feel at home in the UK. I've just moved from Hong Kong about a month ago, and I feel very happy to be back in Britain. I understand the cultural norms. I feel more at home here. So it's not that we have to choose. They are wrong when they tell us that we have to choose. We do not have to choose. We can be British or North American or South African or whatever the case may be, or French. And we can be Jewish, and we don't necessarily need to compromise. Or we don't necessarily, maybe we need to compromise, but we don't necessarily need to choose. We don't need to diminish ourselves to make our Jewishness smaller to be accepted. We're not asking for acceptance. We're demanding it. Remember, Pride started out as a riot. It wasn't asking for rights. We're not going to ask for rights. We will demand them and we will fight for them. And one of the reasons we fight is because we know that we deserve better. We know that the way they treat us is wrong and the way they have treated us is wrong, and we know that we deserve better. And we will integrate if we choose, but we'll do so as proud Jews. I used to work in fashion. There was a brief moment when I came out, unsurprising. And I love clothes. And every day I wake up and think, what am I going to wear? How am I going to represent myself? And the last part of my getting ready process, which now you're all going to know about, is putting on a kippah. I usually wear this tartan one because it's Scottish, which I like, obviously. I'm Scottish if you haven't been able to tell. But I also have one that has a rainbow Magen David. I have other ones that go with different outfits that I wear. And I'm going into the world looking chic, I think, but also as a proud Jew. I can wear my double pleated trousers, my tailored shirt, and my kippah because I do not need to choose. And we should not choose. And understanding the impact of Jew hatred, of any of these experiences on the people we're talking about is vital. We're not theory. We are real. I'm a real person, so are you. So when we talk about Jew hatred, the history, is it anti-Judaism, is it anti-Semitism, is it anti-Jewish racism, whatever it may be, we cannot lose sight in the fact we're talking about real people's experiences. And we have to speak to real people who may not be trained in the academy. And the message we should be saying is, we do not need to choose. You are fine, you are whole, and you're enough. Thank you.
So good afternoon. We're going to make a little segue from Jews can't be part of the left, Jews can't be part of the gay and lesbian movement, now I'm moving to Jews can't be in the feminist movement. In particular, Jews can't be in the feminist movement if they're Zionist. The lecture that I'm about to give is largely American-centered, but I think it has tremendous implications globally. And when you follow with me, I hope that you'll see why I'm saying that. I don't say that out of any degree of happiness, as you can probably tell. About 40 years ago, feminists worldwide, but also particularly in the United States, sounded the alarm about anti-Semitism in women's movements worldwide. And now it seems, in particular, that the American women's movement has become so amenable to anti-Semitism, so utterly amenable to anti-Semitism, that the opprobrium that was once reserved specifically for male perpetrators of things like sexual harassment and violence against women, that degree of scorn has been shifted from those male perpetrators to feminists in particular, and more specifically to those who are Zionist. How this happened and why so few of us seem to notice is going to be the subject of my brief talk. So to begin, I'm going to let you know that last fall, the American Jewish Committee, the AJC, found that nearly 40% of those American Jews it surveyed found that Jews avoided certain places, events, and situations, including identifying as Jewish online. And they have that fear out of concern for their own safety as Jews. One of the things that I see over and over again, we tend to think in triads. So we go left, right, Islam. Right? Here's another triad that's very common. The AJC looks at social media in its study, college campuses, and partisan politics as the potential and most important venues for the expression of anti-Semitism. And my argument today is that the AJC, like so many others, overlooked the power of social movements. And Ben just mentioned the gay and lesbian movement. Social movements, I'm arguing today, are the principal vectors for anti-Semitism, particularly for younger people. And they have tremendous power. While there have been very crucial exposés, usually by journalists, about Black Lives Matter and about women's marches, too few folks seem to be terribly interested in what renders social movements particularly hospitable to Jew hating. And why now? Why the Jew hating now when Jews have been absolutely central to social movements? So why so hospitable to Jew hating, and why now? First, I want to make the argument that it is often assumed that politically marginalized activists within movements are somehow immune from and are unlikely to promote prejudice against others. And this is simply not true. This is incredibly naive. And second, the reverence that is extended to movements similarly ignores their marginalized, their canonized elites who, in pursuing their very own interests, abandon the aspirations of the very people they claim to represent. In other words, we have a lot of very corrupt elites in social movements. And fortunately, this is a structural issue, the rank and file within the social movements have no recourse. The reason that you're able to get rid of Corbyn but not Corbynism is because of partisan politics. You can't do that in social movements. You can't hold people specifically responsible by telling them they have to leave the movement. I wish you could. I think the women's movement would be in a lot better place. I think the gay and lesbian movement would be in a lot better place. Environmental movement, every movement I can think of would be in a better place if it could hold the leadership responsible. Social movements lack that structural accountability. That is a structural reason why movements have become so amenable to anti-Semites. I'll come back to that. Last, and this is really important, particularly since the last series of lectures, the constant conflation of social movements with the left conceals the long-standing racism, heterosexism, misogyny, and anti-Semitism that rendered social movements necessary in the first place. If, in fact, the left was so amenable to fighting for civil rights, women's rights, the environment, we would not have had any need for independent social movements. That gets overlooked. So my argument is, long vulnerable to left co-optation, largely inconceivable as independent, and frequently misrepresented by those the mainstream regards as leaders, we're left in a position that desperately needed critical assessments of social movements are frequently derided as right-wing or ideologically driven. What results from that is a stunning silence and naivete about movements and the cover that social movements now extend to terrorists and their apologists, particularly within academic settings. And it's that I want to focus on now. Case number one. In May of 2021, as Hamas launched over 4,000 missiles, not rockets like toys, missiles into Israel from Gaza, a group, or particularly perhaps an individual, calling itself the Palestinian Feminist Collective online, demanded that gender and women's studies programs adopt a so-called solidarity statement to decry Palestinian oppression. And here featured, with female figures who have apparently no need for eyes, the collective nowhere noted the terrorist organization Hamas, which has ruled Gaza with an iron fist since 2007 with the backing of the Iranian regime. Having omitted its repeated violations of its political opponents, this collective could ignore those Palestinian Arab human rights activists who frankly might prefer citizenship in an open and relatively gender egalitarian state like Israel than life under Islamists. By attributing the Israel-Gaza war and Palestinian oppression exclusively to Israel and not to the authoritarian rulers of either the Gaza, or what folks refer to as the West Bank. The collective portrayed Israel, and you've heard it before, it portrayed Israel as a state that is irredeemably racist, oppressive, settler colonial, and an apartheid state whose people, and this is fundamentally important to recognize, whose people no longer have a right to exist. That is exterminationist rhetoric. That is, like Hamas, a position that calls for the eradication of Jews. That are over 100 women and gender studies programs throughout the United States endorsed this collective statement without even knowing who any of these folks are, if they even exist, is unremarkable. And I want to explain what makes it unremarkable, even if we're shocked. It's unremarkable because many of those programs are affiliated with the National Women's Studies Association in the United States, an association, an academic association, that adopted in 2015 a BDS resolution. So from 2015, women and gender studies associations throughout the United States signed on to BDS. As a result, you have folks like Jasper Puar, who teaches at Rutgers. She's one of many of these academics, who wrote a book called Right to Maim. What is it? You can read some of it, but one of the points that I want to make is that without substantive evidence to support her claims, she insists that the IDF purposefully and sadistically harms and kills non-Jews. It's precisely the blood libel that's in a text like this that now is endorsed by the National Women's Studies Association of the United States, blood libels such as this, have historically been used as pretexts for anti-Semitic assaults, and last summer was no exception. As the collective agitated online, gangs professing to be pro-Palestinian chanted death to Jews, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. And dyke marches played their part. The one in Chicago that was organized adopted this as their flyer. And they also adopted a solidarity statement with Palestinians. And this is the flyer that they distributed to organize the march. Incredibly sexist, does not look like any lesbian that most of us would recognize, with the stiletto boots on and the breast coming. I mean, it's a pornographic caricature, and the breast protruding from the T-shirt. ACAB means all cops are all cops are bastards, okay, which is a sexist term to refer to those born out of so-called wedlock. This is incredibly sexist. I want to talk, we don't have so much time, so I want to talk about the importance of the flags. The blazing Israeli and, so both these flyers come out, the Israeli blazing, the blazing flags of the United States and Israel imply that lesbian liberation, this goes back to Ben's point that you can't also be Jewish and be part of the gay and lesbian movement, implies that lesbian liberation in this context somehow necessitates the demise of two countries where over 85% of the world's Jews live, and places where, at least to some extent, lesbian existence is still recognized. So this is vitally important. Such messaging, though, was a repetition of views that were advanced under the guise of women's rights by the 2017 Women's March influencers, I refuse to call them organizers, they're influencers, who projected the new face of feminism onto the global stage. Through live international coverage, slick logos, and corporate sponsorship. I've never been in a feminist march that had live coverage anywhere, never mind international. Corporate sponsorships by, Johnny Walker. And whenever I see pre-made signs, I get very nervous now. The small group of leftists, and it must be said that's who they were, sold March merchandise through Women's March Inc., which is now a trademarked brand that brought in millions and millions from donors and merch sales. How else could they advertise the kinds of posters that you see right there, the veiled women in the New York Times in full-page ads? Never been to a feminist march that could afford any of this. Despite profiting from nearly identical anti-Trump protests in English worldwide, and you'll also notice everyone in Berlin is holding up signs in English. The middle one's in France. This is in Paris, signs in English. Stockholm in English. Barcelona to the far left, nope, a Hitlerian mustache of Trump. All in English. And one of the things that I find interesting is with veiled women in so-called pink pussy hats, which really irritates me, posters with Trump with the Hitlerian mustaches. I didn't hear any accusations of cultural imperialism. I didn't hear discussions of Holocaust appropriation or even selling out. This is promoted as being, quote, progressive. This is what's being promoted as being on the left. The gushing, and I do mean gushing, coverage extended to these entrepreneurs was unprecedented. These are on the top, they're the top 100 people from Time magazine. On Glamour magazine, you never see feminists represented anywhere. This is what we see. And I think that we see it perhaps not least because these women scarcely centered on women's rights at all. And let me give you an example. While they specifically invited black mothers and sons to the national stage in D.C., mothers whose sons had been killed by police, they specifically excluded black mothers of daughters who were similarly killed by police from the national stage. So it's a very male-centered movement. And why is this important? It's important because far from eliciting the kind of news coverage that could have catalyzed accountability for that violence against those women's daughters and violence against women in general, prominent human rights organizations like Amnesty International, which, by the way, organized the London March. People don't know that. Organizations that had long excluded victims of male violence from their concerns, including the genocide in the former Yugoslavia. Where were they? All of those organizations gained credibility for their ostensible commitment to women's rights, credibility that none of these organizations deserve. That Linda Sarsour was a principal influencer and prominent proponent of Sharia, and the Bernie Brothers campaign, the campaign that helped to defeat Trump's main opponent, Hillary Clinton, in 2016, is not insignificant. In campaigning for the Bernie Bros, she earned street credibility, insisting, and I quote, "Smart women don't vote based on gender." And as a result, you can imagine that an infatuated press promoted Sarsour, who had earlier hailed Saudi Arabia for its 10 weeks of paid maternity leave by tweeting to feminist critics, "And you're worried about women driving? Put us to shame." And so she did put the women's movement to shame. And she did so how? She did so by harassing outspoken Muslim feminists like Ayaan Hirsi Ali online in absolutely vicious ways. And not least, as you also see, by demanding the expulsion early on, before the march, early on, of Zionist and Jewish feminists from the very women's movements that these women in the United States and actually many places throughout the world that these Jewish women had helped establish. Indeed, I provide for you Vanessa Rubble. Why? Because you've probably never heard of her. She's the Jewish founder of the Women's March, who naively brought Sarsour and others in to work alongside her so that it would be a diverse march. And she was one of the first to leave because of why? Because of the anti-Semitism of her co-organizers, like the woman pictured here, Tamika Mallory. Who's Tamika Mallory? She cut her political teeth co-chairing the 20th anniversary of the Nation of Islam's Million Man March in 2015. She worked alongside her father. You need to know that the Nation of Islam is recognized as a black nationalist hate group, and Mallory's defense of it as a positive force for African Americans has helped to extend cover to Louis Farrakhan, to whom she refers to as the GOAT, meaning greatest of all time. In a tweet to the left, he explains that he is not an anti-Semite, he's anti-termite. Her promotion, and this is absolutely key to understanding how the Nation of Islam is moving and is going into the mainstream. Her promotion of the Nation of Islam is, to my mind, reminiscent, and I refuse to refer to as a feminist theorist, her behavior, the promotion of Louis Farrakhan as good for the community, is reminiscent of the gender theorist Judith Butler's insistence that Hamas and Hezbollah be recognized as, quote, progressive social movements of the global left. A position I would say as well, we need to be very mindful of this, a position that is also in keeping with Judith Butler's position about Michel Foucault, whose refusal to condemn the Ayatollah, or even who refused to acknowledge the 50,000 women who in 1979 protested against veiling in Tehran. He refused to recognize that protest and instead dismissed the feminists as kind of antiquated and engaging in attacks on Islam. So this has a long history. That the adulation that Butler offers, Mallory offers, Foucault offers, their adulation of misogynistic anti-Semites, the fact that it has provoked so little ire outside of the Jewish community is, and I'm just focusing now, pardon me, just on the women's movement, is a testament to how weak the women's movement in my country has become. By 2020, support for murderous anti-Semites became so pronounced that socialist women at the Chicago Women's March pictured here, this is from 2020, hailed Leila Khalid as the world's first woman hijacker from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That is a terrorist group. So those are my case studies. The PFC, the Palestinian Feminist Collective, the Women's March, the Dyke March. What do we do? The question that I'm asking is, how did feminism's replacement by these posers, terrorists, and they're ostensibly left-leaning, usually academic apologists, come about? How did this come about? So let me explain to you. By 1990, Islamists began to fill the ideological void that the Soviet Empire, and it was an empire, had previously occupied in demanding women's subordination to a greater cause. We're always expected to do that. That year, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, disparaged feminist mobilizations for universal rights as racist and culturally insensitive, and then claimed the mantle of feminism for itself by adopting its own Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. The OIC is the world's second largest intergovernmental organization after the United Nations, and its 50-plus Muslim majority member countries hold tremendous sway within the United Nations, which explains a lot of the UN's politics. The declaration that they adopted insists on an Islamic perspective on human rights consistent with Sharia. What does this mean? These include the right of husbands to discipline their wives, divorce them at will, and deny them permission to even leave their homes. Cairo, though, was not the only OIC effort to inform human rights discourse on the international stage. Let me go back and tell you that in 1975, it labored alongside the PLO and the Soviet Union to have the United Nations' first International Women's Conference explicitly condemn anti-Semitism, explicitly condemn Zionism as racism, in advance of its infamous resolution. The so-called Women's Decade that followed from 1975 essentially descended into anti-Zionist diatribes under the leadership of UN General Secretary Kurt Waldheim. Kurt Waldheim was a Nazi, and his centralized, top-down, bureaucratically managed international campaign against Israel persisted during his tenure from 1972 to 1981, and by the way, long after. And that's most recently evidenced in the 2001 United Nations World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, again with a lot of input from the OIC. That conference offered an major international venue for disparaging Jews as divisive proponents of racism. And it did so through flyers like the one seen here, which imagined a better world if only Hitler had won. The conference ended with thousands of the people who had attended and their allies marching on Durban's Jewish Club, where Jews sheltered under the protection of riot police. Under the guise of opposing racism, the online harassment against Jews continues and is exemplified by this, and frank caricatures and related tweets like the one seen here. Called a so-called Becky, a white, racist, materialistic, privileged, and politically unconscious female, and frank memes that were supposedly once associated with the far right. I don't subscribe to this notion of left-right. I think of it as a convergence. The memes once associated with the far right have been repurposed. And you see that really clearly here. The unwitting emulation of Nazism by those of color represents one of the most disheartening aspects of contemporary anti-Semitism. Really one of the most disheartening. Anne Frank and those who teach her are now blamed somehow for America's inexcusable inattention to and racist disparagement of African Americans, while at the same time Jews are gaslighted about racism's centrality to the Holocaust. And I also want to say that having denied Jews the ability to name their own experiences, anti-Semitism continues in renaming Jews, and I would say in renaming women in particular. I would like us to recall that Nazi renaming of Jewish men as Israel and Jewish women as Sarah took place in 1939 under Nazis. So I want to conclude just by saying that by cloaking anti-Semitism in egalitarian garb and painting Jews as disloyal to women's movements, the movements that they helped to establish, self-proclaimed progressives, women and gender studies programs, and so-called women's marches have become an incredibly powerful weapon in the arsenal of hipster anti-Semitism. And I think that countering their message and related optics is going to necessitate our exposing the sexual politics of these folks as dangerously dystopic and in league with the very reactionary forces that they claim to oppose or maybe want to realistically oppose. Often looked at as anti-establishment, I would just conclude that movements have become the new venues for a very old hatred. Thank you.